Troy Storfjell is Associate Professor of Nordic Studies at Pacific Lutheran University, teaching in the Department of Languages and Literatures. Encouraging critical reading habits with his students, an emphasis on literature and cultural studies allows him to explore the aesthetics and ethics of colonization and resistance, settler, colonial, and indigenous texts, drawing on Sami and trans-indigenous critical perspectives. A dual citizen of Norway and the United States, Storfjell is situated between academic worlds of Sami knowledge and Western knowledge, fixating on indigenous philosophical and intellectual traditions. Currently, he is launching a Native American and Indigenous Studies program at Pacific Lutheran University, which he chairs, and he has also been a guest researcher in the Department of Culture and Literature at the University of Tromsø in Norway. Welcome, Troy. We're so grateful to have you here today as a part of this greater conversation and our mini conversation. So we'd like to begin by asking you, what does it mean to be authentically Sami in contemporary culture, especially given the layered nature of geography and social identities?
Geet, thank you for the question. It's a really complicated question. Before I start to attempt a bit of an answer to that, because that's something that we can't answer in one short little session. But before, I would just like to acknowledge the Duwamish nation on whose traditional lands this beautiful building sits, and the Muckleshoot Nation, who are the treaty tribe for this area as well. Authenticity is a problematic concept, and it's a concept that really arises out of modernity, out of the sort of alienation experienced by modernity with industrialization, commodity capitalism, people becoming cut off from their connection to the land, to the sites of production. And it's certainly something that people talk about a lot in relationship to indigenous peoples. Oftentimes it's the non-indigenous peoples talking about this, using the term authenticity. Modernity, of course, is something that we, Sami, and other indigenous peoples experience as well. And there's often this idea and in fact, a little story, about 20 years ago, when I was a young assistant professor in the Midwest, I was at a conference in South Dakota, or in North Dakota, and there was a senior literature professor from the University of Oslo there, and he was asking me about my research, and I had just finished my dissertation, so that's what I could talk about. I mentioned that I'd been working at representations of the Sami in literature. And he stopped and he looked out the window and he goes, "Oh, just imagine an entire people that hasn't experienced modernity." And I hadn't told him that I myself am Sami. And at that point, I just thought, have I not experienced modernity? I had thought that I had experienced modernity. And of course, Maori scholar Linda Tuhuwai-Smith, in her book Decolonizing Methodologies, she writes that colonization is indigenous peoples' modernity. Because colonization alienates us from the sites of our own production and the sources of our own meaning. And even more so, it situates us in the global networks of resource redistribution that enabled urban growth and industrialization in Europe and North America, for example. So, this is just one of the aspects to trying to approach the answer to the question. And of course, layered geography is really important. That's what colonization does, especially settler colonization, which is what we have in Sapmi, where outside settlers have come in and incorporated Sapmi into the 4 states. And so the same place means something different to different people. And then with that, we get, as you mentioned, layered identity. For the Sami, as for many indigenous people, it's a question of who claims you. You are Sami if Sami people claim you as Sami. Certainly, with the advent of the Sami parliaments in the 3 Nordic states, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, we've come to have legal definitions of who can vote, who is eligible to vote for those. So people like me are in the Sami electorate. I can vote for representatives in Norway, but that's never been posited as the only definition of who is Sami. Because it's really, are you claimed by Sami communities? Are you identified as Sami? we say it's about a relationship to the land, but of course that relationship differs for different people. Some Sami people live on the land in ways that look very similar to the ways their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents lived on the land, and other Sami people live in cities. We have a Sami diaspora. Some of us are professors in Tacoma, Washington. So there's many different ways of relating to that land, and you can't say there's just one way. And so there's a room for pluralism, room for discussion, and it's a site of contestation, a site of conversation. And then the question is, how much of settler modernity do we want to incorporate? How much do we have to admit that we have incorporated? And how much of our traditional livelihoods, lifestyles, and even more difficultly, our traditional ways of knowing, do we retain or do we strive to retain? And there's no one unified answer to that. Those are the things we discuss and debate and go back and forth on.
Thank you.
Great. So you have identified this kind of tapestry of layered identities. And I think you're right to identify that modernity, and I guess even the international movement among indigenous peoples, acts as a sort of pressure upon the community to act as a sort of block with this idea of authenticity, cultural authenticity. And one scholar you had us read a couple weeks back, Raunak Wokanen, kind of brought up the tension there that there's people in the Sami community that kind of benefit from that, and then people in there that don't. So there's tension within the community to either identify with that or not. So how do the Sami reconcile that, or how do they navigate that tension between feeling pressured to kind of act as a collective for this international solidarity movement and also, I guess, decolonizing their experience?
That's another great question that we could talk about for forever.
I know.
And one that
Take your best shot.
one that there's no consensus on.
Yeah.
It's also a site of contestation and conversation. It's almost banal to invoke intersectionality, I think, but that we have to start with that in talking about any group. Of course, Sami people are also gendered and have different sexual orientations and have different ages and different socioeconomic classes, et cetera. But in talking about Sami layered identities, we're talking about intersectionality plus. So we have 10 distinct cultural linguistic groups divided between 4 states. Then each of these groups has many different communities living in different parts of the land with different traditional livelihoods and different colonial histories. So you have just by community and by family many differences already, and then we have this other type of difference, which is differing degrees to which we've internalized sort of the settler colonial mindset, the settler colonial way of knowing, way of doing things. And I think in Scandinavia or the Nordic region, so in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, things are significantly different in Russia, and I'm not as up to date on things in Russia, so I'll talk more about the Nordic side. Many Sami have really been well trained in working within the system. And so it's a rhetoric of rights and recognition that has been used by Sami rights activists, looking for recognition from the state, looking for the state to acknowledge indigenous rights, working then within the state system to create these Sami parliaments, and from the Sami parliaments then working in an international system, both within the Nordic Council and within the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. And what we've achieved in these 3 countries is the right of consultation for the Sami parliaments, that the state parliaments have to consult the Sami parliaments before enacting measures that directly impact the Sami. But this differs from what, for example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples puts forward, which is the right to free, prior, informed consent. The right to consultation is different from the right to free, prior, informed consent. And so this is already one of the things that many Sami people are arguing we ought to be pushing for. And we have critics of this rhetoric of rights and recognition also within Sami academia, Sami society, from multiple perspectives. But one of the largest ones is people who buy into then the idea of sovereignty, that rather than working within the system, one ought to work outside the system, within our own systems. And we see this, for example, the Swedish Sami parliament, as an organ of the Swedish state, is prohibited by law from filing lawsuits against the Swedish state. So how do the Sami elected representatives rather, advocate for the Sami when they can't file lawsuits? These are some of the systems. The major issues facing, I think, that unite people, whether you're opposed to working within the system or very much in favor of working within it, are resource exploitation. That's the most pressing issue facing most Sami communities in the Nordic states today. We've had, of course, cultural colonization in Norway. We had a long century of Norwegianization, and we still face discrimination and racism. But the most pressing issue for many people is development and resource extraction. And I think what we're seeing is a variety of approaches working in sync. So some people working within the system, some from outside the system, and many sort of straddling it. The Norwegian Sami Parliament last year sent a letter to investors in a mining operation in the Repparfjorden in Finnmark, for example, explaining to them exactly how they were interfering in Sami reindeer herding and fishing livelihoods after the Norwegian Parliament had approved this. So many people criticized the Sami Parliament for sort of taking a step that was at odds with the decision of the state. And I think here we see people sort of straddling the line between working within the system and working outside the system, if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think so. Maybe with the last few minutes we have, I'll ask a bit of a lighter question, but do you have a piece of maybe Sami lore or literature? I know that you're a humanist and a literature scholar. Something like that, some Sami story or something that you think that a Western audience needs to hear.
What needs to hear, I don't know.
Or would appreciate hearing.
I had several stories that I was batting around, and then I had to double check, and one of the ones was one I already told your class. I discovered, so I won't repeat that one. But I think illustrative of this idea or this problematic of people like me who've gone through university systems and learned sort of, we have a piece of paper that says we've mastered Western academia to one degree or another, that we survive within it. And how does that relate to then people in traditional communities? I have a good friend, her name is Dr. Kiki Janslatten, and she's the daughter of the late Nils Janslatten, who was a leading Sami linguist and scholar at what was then the University of Tromsø, now Norway's Arctic University. And in her dissertation, she shared a number of stories that her father had told her and a number of experiences she'd had with her father. And one of them was, so they are river Sami from the Diatnu River, which runs along the border between Norway and Finland. And they were going back from Tromsø one summer to where they traditionally fish and pick cloudberries. And they got to this lake, and they saw some of their relatives camped on the other side of the lake. So they got into a boat and started rowing across the lake to see their relatives. And what they heard their relatives shouting to each other as they were packing their things up is, "Quick, here come the researchers, let's hide." And it was their cousins. I mean, this is not a case of external Norwegian or Finnish research. This is Sami researchers coming into their own home community as now outsiders. And I think it's important for those of us who engage in scholarly work on Indigenous communities, whether we ourselves are Indigenous or not, to remember that by virtue of working within the university system, we may be seen as threatening and intruding by the people in the community. And it's important to bear that in mind and come in with a sense of humility, I think.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Troy. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. The pleasure's mine.
Thank you.